Wauneta, Nebraska, August 1922. The sun beat down on the cut-over land, baking the pale soil and withering the sparse grass that clung to life between the stumps of long-gone trees. In this landscape of horizontal lines, the horizon, the furrow, the roofline of a distant soddy, one shape defied the logic of the prairie. A cylinder, stark and white, rose 40 feet into the merciless blue sky. It was a ghost of a more prosperous time, a decommissioned glazed tile grain silo left behind by a farm that had failed. And at its base, a man named Gustaf Lindqvist was methodically chipping away mortar, preparing to cut a door where no door had ever been. From the dirt track that served as a road, two men watched from the seat of a dusty county-owned automobile. Beaumont Ashcroft, the Chase County agricultural agent, squinted, his face a mask of professional skepticism. He was a man of regulations and proven methods, of seed varietals and crop rotation charts. What he was seeing did not compute. "He's not just fixing it, is he?" asked Jedediah Vance, the local carpenter, who'd hitched a ride with Ashcroft out of sheer curiosity. "Heard tell he bought it for scrap value." "Worse," Ashcroft said, adjusting his collar. "He means to live in it. Him, the wife, two little ones. Filed a Homestead improvement claim on a feed bin." He made a note on his clipboard. The scratching of his pencil was the only sound besides the wind and the distant tink-tink-tink of Gustaf's hammer. "The man's a fool. It's a violation of the 1911 Farm Improvements Code, plain and simple. A silo is for stock feed, not a dwelling for a family." Another neighbor, Silas Croft, pulled his mule to a stop nearby, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. "A man would have to be crazy," Silas declared, his voice carrying easily on the dry air. "Come January, that thing will be a 40-foot icicle with his family frozen inside. Tile draws the cold. Everyone knows that." Gustaf heard them. He had to, but he didn't turn. He simply selected another spot, drew a chalk line, and set his chisel. The mockery was a steady hum, like the cicadas in the blighted trees. It had been there for weeks, at the general store, after church, over fence lines. They saw a Swede with strange ideas, a man trying to build a home out of a farm appliance. They saw a madman building a tomb for his own children. What did this Swedish-American silo builder, a man who spoke more fluently in the language of mortar and tension hoops than in English, understand about cylindrical mass and vertical convection that the most experienced farmers and county agents in Nebraska had missed? The answer to that question would change how people survived on the high plains. It was an answer paid for in hardship, written in physics, and proven in the heart of a winter that would break men who lived in proper, square-walled houses. If you stay with us, I promise you will learn the simple, powerful principles that allowed one family to live in shirt sleeves while their neighbors froze. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten ingenuity, and tell us in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Gustaf Lindqvist was not a housewright. He had never framed a wall, pitched a conventional roof, or glazed a sash window in his life. He was a man of the circle, a man of staves and hoops, of vitrified clay tile and Portland cement, of tension rods and silo throats. Back in Skåne, the southernmost province of Sweden, he had worked for a farming cooperative, one of a traveling crew that erected the magnificent tile-ringed silos that were transforming Scandinavian agriculture. He knew how the tiles, each one curved and hollow-celled, locked together to form a structure of immense strength. He knew the precise torque to apply to the steel hoops that girded the cylinder, compressing it into a monolithic whole. He understood that a silo wasn't just a container. It was an engine of preservation. Its job was to protect the energy stored in 10,000 bushels of grain from the ravages of moisture, pests, and, most importantly, extreme temperature fluctuations. A silo was built for stillness. When he, his wife Elin, and their two small children, Anders and Linnea, arrived in Nebraska in 1921, they had brought with them little more than their Swedish Bibles and a belief in the promise of land. The land they could afford was marginal, cut-over ground that had been logged and abandoned, its soil thin and unforgiving. Their first home was a hastily constructed soddy, the standard dwelling of the plains settler. And their first winter was a lesson in the brutal physics of the cold. Gustaf remembered that winter not as a season, but as a series of specific failures. He remembered the sound of their neighbor's Model T radiator bursting its top tank with a sharp crack, a plume of steam rising like a ghost in the sub-zero air. He remembered the night the cold was so deep and dry that the leather binding on the family Bible, resting on a small table far from the stove, contracted and split with a noise like a pistol shot. Most terrifyingly, he remembered the kerosene in their main lamp thickening in the reservoir, the congealed fuel refusing to draw up the wick, plunging their small room into flickering darkness and a cold that felt absolute. Elin had bundled Anders and Linnea in every blanket they owned, her face a pale, grim mask in the faint light of the stove. They had survived, but it was a miserable, soul-crushing existence, a constant battle fought for every degree of warmth, a battle they were slowly losing. All winter long, Gustaf fed their small stove, watching the precious heat radiate out, hit the damp earthen walls, and vanish. The house was a sieve for warmth. The problem, as Gustaf came to understand it, wasn't the stove. The problem was the square. In their soddy, and in the wood frame houses of his neighbors, the corners were the enemy. They were geometric dead zones where airflow stagnated. Warm air would rise to the ceiling, push out towards the walls, and sink as it cooled. But it never properly circulated in the corners. Moisture from breath and cooking would collect there, condensing on the cold surfaces and turning to thick white frost that would creep inward day by day. A square house was a collection of thermal weaknesses held together by a frame. It demanded a huge, roaring fire at its center just to keep the edges from freezing solid. It was an inefficient, fuel-hungry design fundamentally at odds with the environment. That spring, while looking for salvageable timber, Gustaf came across the abandoned silo. It stood on a rise, gleaming white in the sun. The farm around it was gone, the fields reclaimed by prairie grass, the barn a skeleton of collapsed timbers. But the silo was perfect. He walked around it, running his hand over the smooth glazed tiles. He tapped them with his knuckles, hearing the solid, resonant thud. He saw the steel hoops, rusted, but still holding their tension. The other settlers saw a ruin, a piece of useless farm equipment. Gustaf saw a solution. He saw a home without corners. His neighbor's suffering was a constant, low-grade misery. Silas Croft spent most of his autumn days chopping and hauling wood, creating a massive pile that looked like it could last for years, but Silas knew it would be mostly gone by February. His two-room frame house leaked heat from a dozen places, around the ill-fitting window frames, through the uninsulated attic, directly through the thin clapboard walls. The family lived in their kitchen, a single potbelly stove their only source of warmth, the rest of the house sealed off and left to freeze. Jedediah Vance, the carpenter, had a better-built house, but he faced the same fundamental problems. He understood insulation. He'd even packed sawdust between the wall studs, but he couldn't defeat the laws of thermodynamics. The relentless Nebraska wind, finding every microscopic crack, forced cold air in and pulled warm air out, a process called infiltration. His family slept in their coats, waking to find a pane of ice on the inside of their bedroom windows. The conventional wisdom was simply to burn more wood, to fight the cold with brute force. But Gustaf saw that this was a losing proposition. You couldn't defeat the winter. You had to build a structure that ignored it. He bought the silo and the 5 acres it stood on for $17. The work began in late summer. His tools were simple: a heavy sledge, a star drill, cold chisels, and a masonry hammer. Cutting the openings for a door and 3 windows was the hardest part. For 2 weeks, the sound of steel on tile echoed across the flat land. He worked with a patient rhythm, drilling a series of holes and then carefully chiseling out the space between them, ensuring the integrity of the surrounding tiles. Neighbors would stop and watch, shaking their heads. "You'll weaken the whole structure," Jedediah Vance warned him one afternoon. "A cylinder gets its strength from being whole. You start cutting holes in it, a strong north wind will peel it like a tin can." Gustaf just nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The hoops are strong," he said, his English clipped and precise. It was his standard reply to most criticisms. Inside the silo was a cool, dark space that smelled of old grain and earth. It was 14 feet in diameter. His plan was for 3 floors. He sourced thick hardwood beams and, using the skills he'd learned in Sweden, began fitting them to the curve of the silo wall. This was the most ingenious part of the construction. He didn't just rest the joists on a ledge. He fashioned custom iron brackets that he bolted directly through the tile walls, with large plate washers on the exterior to distribute the load. The floor joists for the 2nd and 3rd levels were then hung from these brackets, creating a rigid, integrated structure. The floors didn't just sit inside the silo, they became part of it, adding to its strength rather than compromising it. He laid down thick plank flooring, leaving a 2-foot square opening in the center of the 2nd and 3rd floors. This was the chimney, the central artery for the heat that would bring the home to life. He bought a small, efficient potbelly stove and placed it on a stone hearth directly in the middle of the ground floor. Its stovepipe would run straight up through the 2 openings, passing through all 3 levels of the home before exiting through the conical roof. For light, especially on the top floor that would serve as the children's bedroom, he built a single, large dormer window into the roof, a complex feat of carpentry that showed he was more than just a mason. Elin watched the construction with a quiet, unwavering faith. She had endured the Saudi. She trusted her husband. "It looks like a giant's milk bottle," she said one evening, a small smile on her face, as she looked up at the dormer. "It will be warm," Gustaf replied. That was the only promise that mattered. In October, Beaumont Ashcroft made his official visit. He walked through the nearly completed structure, his face unreadable. He tapped the tile walls. He stomped on the solid wood floors. He looked up the central channel where the stovepipe would go. "Lindqvist," he began, pulling out his clipboard. "I can't approve this. The 1911 code is very specific. A dwelling must have a continuous foundation, standard wood framing, and a minimum number of windows. This is an agricultural structure. It's for ensilage." He clicked his pen. "I'm afraid the county cannot approve your homestead improvement credit. You'll have to pay the full property tax, and I'll have to file a report of non-compliance." This was a serious blow. The credit was essential for a family with so little cash. Losing it meant they would struggle to buy seed come spring, to buy the very necessities of life. It was economic warfare, delivered with polite bureaucratic regret. Gustaf looked at the agricultural agent. He didn't argue about the code or plead his case. He simply gestured to the thick, curved walls. "This will be warm," he said. Ashcroft shook his head. "It's not about warmth. It's about the law." He finished his notes and left. The official condemnation delivered. The mockery of his neighbors was one thing. This was a threat to their entire future on this land. But Gustaf did not stop. He finished the floors, installed the stove, and with Elin and the children, moved their few possessions into the silo just as the first cold winds of November began to blow. The genius of Gustaf's silo home was not in any single component, but in the elegant interplay of two fundamental laws of physics, thermal mass and vertical convection. His neighbors, in their wood frame houses, lived inside thermally lightweight shells. Their thin walls had very little capacity to store heat. When their stoves were burning, the air inside the house would warm up quickly. But as soon as the fire died down, that heat would radiate out into the cold just as fast. They were constantly pouring energy into a leaking bucket. Gustaf's home was the opposite. It was a thermal battery. The walls were 6-inch thick, vitrified clay tiles, a material far denser than wood. Each square foot of the wall weighed approximately 130 pounds. A simple calculation reveals the staggering scale of this thermal reservoir. The silo, with a 14-foot diameter and 40-foot height, had a surface area of roughly 1,760 square feet. This meant the total weight of the tile in the walls was over 228,000 pounds, or 114 tons. It was a fortress of mass. During the day, the small potbelly stove didn't just heat the air inside the silo, it poured thermal energy, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs, into those tons of tile. The glazed surface of the tile was a poor insulator, but the mass behind it was a phenomenal heat sink. For every linear foot of its height, the silo wall could absorb and store approximately 11,000 BTUs of energy. Once this mass was warmed, it did not cool down quickly. It became a massive, gentle radiator, releasing its stored heat back into the living space slowly and evenly throughout the night, long after the fire in the stove had banked down to embers. While his neighbors' homes experienced wild temperature swings, the silo's interior climate remained remarkably stable. This effect was amplified by the second principle, vertical convection in a cylinder. In a square house, heat rises from the stove, pools uselessly at the ceiling, and the corners remain stubbornly cold. But the silo had no corners. The potbelly stove, placed directly in the center of the ground floor, created a powerful column of rising warm air. This column ascended through the openings in the second and third floors, helped along by the hot stovepipe radiating heat along the entire central axis of the building. As the warm air reached the conical roof, it was deflected outwards and downwards along the smooth, curved walls. As it descended, it cooled slightly, finally reaching the ground floor to be drawn back towards the stove and reheated, completing a perfect, continuous convective loop. This constant circulation meant that the entire volume of air in the silo was being used efficiently. There were no dead spots, no stagnant cold pockets. The physics of the space ensured that every BTU generated by the stove was put to work, warming the living area and charging the thermal battery of the walls. A fascinating consequence of this vertical system was that the upper floors were naturally warmer than the ground floor. Heat, after all, rises. Gustaf measured it himself with a small thermometer. The loft space, where Anders and Linnea slept, consistently tracked 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the ground floor living area, without any additional heating. In a conventional house, this would be a sign of inefficiency. In the silo, it was a deliberate feature of the design, a system that delivered the most warmth to the sleeping quarters automatically. His neighbors saw a feed bin. Gustaf saw a perfectly engineered heat engine. The winter arrived not gradually, but like an invading army. In the third week of December, a vast dome of Arctic high pressure settled over the northern plains, pushing a wave of polar air down from Canada. The temperature plummeted. For 8 consecutive days, the thermometer in Wauneta never rose above -30 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless north wind blew at a steady 20 miles per hour, scouring the landscape and driving the wind chill to a life-threatening 50 or 60 below zero. It was a dry, crystalline cold that seemed to leach the very life out of the world. Across 4 counties, the iron gears of windmills, their grease frozen solid, welded themselves to their gearboxes. Livestock were found frozen standing in the fields. It was a winter that tested every settler, every structure, every scrap of conventional wisdom. Inside the frame house of Jedediah Vance, the carpenter, the battle was constant. He and his family lived entirely in the kitchen, the door to the rest of the house stuffed with rags. Ice coated the inside of the windows in a sheet an inch thick. Every hour, day and night, he had to feed the stove, the wood burning with a desperate, hungry roar. He could feel the cold radiating from the walls, a palpable presence. But inside the silo, a strange and profound peace reigned. Gustaf fed his small pot-belly stove a few logs of seasoned cottonwood every 3 or 4 hours. The stove never roared. It hummed, a low, steady thrum of combustion. The air was still. There were no drafts. On the ground floor, Elin could work at her sewing table in a simple wool dress. The sound of Linnea humming to her doll filled the quiet space, a sound impossible in a home, where every breath plumed as visible fog. The air smelled of baking bread and coffee. The great mass of the walls, saturated with warmth, had become a gentle, unceasing source of comfort. The ultimate proof of the silo's success sat on the windowsill of the dormer on the top floor. It was a simple glass jar of lingonsylt, the sweet, tart lingonberry jam that Elin made every autumn, a taste of their Swedish home. In any other house in Chase County, that jar, sitting next to the glass, would have been a solid block of frozen red ice by the first night of the cold snap. The intense cold radiating from the window pane would have frozen it instantly, the expanding ice likely shattering the glass. But in the silo, the jar of lingonsylt remained perfectly clear, perfectly liquid. The gentle, constant circulation of warm air throughout the cylinder created a thermal buffer, preventing the cold from the window from penetrating even a few inches into the room. The jam stayed ready to be poured, a small ruby-colored testament to the success of Gustaf's design. While his neighbors watched their canned goods burst in their pantries, Gustaf Lindqvist's family could enjoy jam from a windowsill in the heart of a polar vortex. Christmas Eve arrived on the 8th day of the relentless cold. The sky was a pale, indifferent gray, the wind still howling from the north. Beaumont Ashcroft buttoned his heavy coat, pulled his hat down low, and set out from town. He carried a final, official notice of non-compliance for Gustaf Lindqvist, a document that felt absurdly bureaucratic in the face of the life-threatening weather. Still, the law was the law. His Model T chugged bravely through the deepening drifts, its engine complaining against the cold. He was less than 100 yards from the silo when it happened. A sudden lurch, a loud hiss, and a great white cloud of steam erupted from under the hood. The radiator, its water finally succumbing to the brutal temperature, had frozen and burst. It was the exact failure Gustaf had witnessed in his neighbor 2 years prior. Stranded, with the temperature at 34 below zero and the sun beginning to set, Ashcroft had no choice. Cursing his luck and the cold, he wrapped a scarf over his face and began the short, agonizing walk to the silo, the only shelter in sight. He was heading there to serve a warning. Now he was heading there to beg for help, or at least the use of a telephone. He stumbled through the gate, his lungs aching with every frigid breath. He approached the strange round house expecting the worst. Every farmhouse he had ever visited in weather like this had the same feel from the outside. A beleaguered outpost, windows thick with frost, a sense of misery seeping through the very walls. He braced himself as he knocked on the heavy wooden door. When the door swung open, the first thing he expected was a blast of frigid air from inside, the inevitable result of opening a door in a poorly sealed house. He expected to see a family huddled in blankets around a stove. The vindication moment was built on sensory contrast. What he expected to feel was the familiar, biting cold of a frontier cabin in winter. What he actually felt was stillness. A soft, enveloping, utterly dry warmth washed over his face. There was no draft, no swirling air. It was as if he had stepped through a portal into a different season. Gustaf Lindqvist stood in the doorway, wearing a simple shirt and trousers, no coat. Behind him, Ashcroft could see the warm glow of a lamp on a wooden table. "Mr. Ashcroft," Gustaf said, his voice calm, "you are in trouble?" "Radiator," Ashcroft managed to say, his lips numb. "Froze solid." "Come in," Gustaf said simply, holding the door wide. Ashcroft stepped across the threshold, and the world changed. The wind noise vanished, replaced by a profound silence. The warmth was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove, but a gentle, pervasive comfort that seemed to radiate from the very walls themselves. He took off his gloves, his stiff fingers slowly uncurling. A little girl with blonde braids, Linnea, looked up at him from the floor where she was playing with wooden blocks, her cheeks rosy. She was wearing a simple cotton dress. Elin offered him a cup of coffee, and his hands, shaking from the cold, wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. He sat at their table, sipping the hot liquid, and looked around the circular room. It was tidy, peaceful, and impossibly, unbelievably warm. "How?" Ashcroft asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What is your secret?" Gustaf gestured towards the stovepipe ascending through the ceiling. "No corners," he said. "The heat must go around." After a second cup of coffee, Gustaf led him up the sturdy spiral staircase built around the silo's inner curve. The warmth followed them, even growing slightly as they ascended. On the top floor, under the gentle slope of the conical roof, was the children's sleeping area. A thermometer hung from a wooden beam. Ashcroft leaned in to read it. The mercury stood at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68 degrees, while outside a polar wind howled at 34 below. A 102-degree difference. And there, on the sill of the dormer window, sat the jar of lingonberry jam. Ashcroft walked over to it, the floorboards solid under his boots. He looked through the window at the bleak, frozen landscape, then down at the jam, its contents perfectly fluid. He reached out a bare hand and touched the inside of the tile wall next to the window. He expected it to feel like a block of ice. It was cool, yes, but it wasn't the biting, energy-sucking cold of a normal wall. It was the neutral coolness of a massive object that had been thoroughly warmed. It felt stable, solid, permanent. All of Ashcroft's certainty, all his knowledge of codes and regulations, evaporated in that moment. He saw not a code violation, but a profound and elegant solution to the single greatest problem of prairie life. He turned to Gustaf, his eyes wide with a new understanding. "My God, Lindqvist," Ashcroft said, his voice quiet with awe. He wasn't speaking as a county agent anymore, but as a man who had just witnessed a miracle of common sense. "You didn't build a house. You built a kiln for living in." The official warning notice remained in his frozen coat pocket, forgotten. Beaumont Ashcroft spent the night sleeping on a cot on the second floor, warmer and more soundly than he had in his own government-approved house in town. The next morning, Christmas Day, Gustaf helped him drain and patch the broken radiator on his car. When Ashcroft returned to his office, he did not file the non-compliance report. Instead, he wrote a long, detailed letter to his superiors at the University of Nebraska Extension in Lincoln. He described the silo, the polar blast, and the 102-degree temperature differential. He called it the most thermally efficient farm dwelling in the state of Nebraska. His letter found its way to the editor of the Nebraska Farmer, the most widely read agricultural journal in the region. Intrigued, the editor sent a writer and a photographer to Oneida in the late spring of 1923. The resulting article, published in the April issue, was a sensation, titled "The Silo House, a Swedish Settler's Answer to the Polar Blast." It featured detailed photographs of the Lindqvist home and, most importantly, a clear, simple floor plan drafted by Gustaf himself. The idea spread like wildfire across the cutover lands of southwest Nebraska and northern Kansas. Farmers, beaten down by brutal winters and high fuel costs, saw a path to survival. Decommissioned silos, previously considered worthless, were suddenly a valuable commodity. That summer, a wave of conversions began. The article noted that 11 families across 3 counties had acquired and begun work on silo homes by the time the harvest came in. They followed Gustaf's plan, bolting joists to the tile, running a stovepipe up the center, and cutting windows for light. The era of the silo house had begun, a small but powerful testament to an idea that worked. Gustaf Lindqvist's silo home was more than just a clever bit of frontier engineering. It was a prescient example of modern building science. Decades before terms like thermal mass and passive heating became part of the architectural lexicon, Gustaf had intuitively grasped their core principles. His 114 tons of tile wall functioned as a massive heat sink, a concept now central to energy-efficient design in concrete and masonry buildings. His focus on a compact, airtight structure with minimal window openings anticipated the modern emphasis on the building envelope as the first line of defense against heat loss. The central convection loop he created is a textbook example of efficient heat distribution, a principle that sophisticated HVAC systems now strive to replicate. He had built, out of necessity and experience, a primitive version of a high-performance home, proving that the smartest designs are often the simplest. In the end, the silo's purpose was not subverted. It was fulfilled. A grain silo is a vessel of preservation. It is designed to take the concentrated energy of a summer's harvest, the captured sunlight and soil nutrients stored in every kernel of corn, and protect it from the entropy of winter. It is built to maintain a quiet, stable, internal environment against the chaotic violence of the external world. Gustaf Lindqvist looked at his family and saw them in the same terms. They were his harvest, their warmth, their laughter, their life. That was the energy he needed to preserve. He didn't build a house by the standards of men who wrote codes in warm offices. He simply looked at a structure designed to keep the grain quiet and safe through the winter. And he taught that cylinder, with its great mass and honest geometry, how to keep his family quiet and safe in kind. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you believe that simple wisdom can often outperform complex regulations, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of practical genius. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What modern building techniques do you think were anticipated by pioneers like Gustaf Lindqvist? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by historical building practices and principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction. The techniques described are based on real historical precedents, but any application of these or similar methods today should be undertaken only after consulting with qualified professionals and in accordance with all current building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.